Welcome back to Psych Muse, the channel where timeless philosophy and psychology meet to decode the human soul. Today's question is powerful, emotional, and deeply transformative. What happens when the empath finally chooses themselves? For so long, empaths, the people who feel the emotions of others almost as if they were their own, have carried invisible burdens. They often live as healers, mediators, and peacekeepers, constantly giving, sacrificing, and even breaking themselves so that others may feel whole. But what happens when the empath stops and decides to turn all that love, all that care, all that healing energy inward toward themselves? To answer this, we turn to two great minds, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst who explored the depths of the unconscious, and Byung-Chul Han, the contemporary philosopher who dissects the pressures of modern life and the exhaustion of the soul. Together, they give us a roadmap to understand not only why empaths suffer, but also what transformations unfold when they finally reclaim their own power. This video is divided into 7 parts, but today we begin with the foundation: why the empath struggles in the first place, and what happens in the earliest stages of choosing themselves. Part 1. The burden of the empath, Jung's shadow and the wounded healer. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For the empath, this truth hits harder than most, because the empath's life is often structured around avoiding their own pain by focusing entirely on the suffering of others. Psychology has long noted that many empaths are, in fact, wounded healers. Jung used this concept to describe those who have endured deep suffering themselves, and through that suffering, developed the capacity to feel, sense, and nurture the pain of others. But the danger is clear. The healer forgets to heal themselves. The empath becomes addicted to giving, an unconscious bargain that says, if I can fix others, maybe I can avoid looking at my own brokenness. This is the shadow at work. Jung's shadow is the part of ourselves we repress or deny. For empaths, the shadow often hides anger, resentment, and even exhaustion, because they believe these emotions are selfish or bad. Byung-Chul Han adds a modern dimension to this. In his writings on the burnout society, he argues that today's culture pushes people to constantly perform, to always be available, to always say yes. Empaths, already wired to put others first, become the perfect victims of this demand. They stretch themselves thin until their soul whispers the warning signs: anxiety, depression, and the silent scream of burnout. So the first burden of the empath is this: they lose themselves in others. They dissolve their identity in service, and in doing so, they forget they exist as individuals worthy of love, rest, and freedom. When the empath finally chooses themselves, the first shift is shocking. It feels like betrayal. It feels like disloyalty. But in truth, it is the first courageous step into wholeness, the step Jung called individuation, the process of becoming your true self, not the mask you wear for others. Part 2. The awakening, turning the mirror inward. The second stage begins like a quiet rebellion. The empath, who has always said yes, experiments with the word no. At first, it trembles on their lips. But over time, that no becomes a declaration of existence. Jung wrote that the soul cannot grow until it faces its own depths. Choosing themselves requires the empath to stop projecting their inner wounds onto others and instead sit with their own reflection. This is terrifying, but it is also liberating. Imagine someone who has always lived as a mirror, reflecting everyone else's emotions, moods, and desires. When that mirror finally turns inward, they see not just their pain, but also their beauty, their strength, their forgotten passions. They see the child within them who was once ignored, silenced, or shamed into believing that love must always be earned through sacrifice. Byung-Chul Han's philosophy connects here too. He warns us that the age of hyperpositivity, where everyone must constantly appear happy, productive, and available, kills authenticity. The empath, in choosing themselves, begins to resist this pressure. They no longer bend under the weight of endless demands. They withdraw from toxic relationships. They stop apologizing for rest, for silence, for solitude. And then something remarkable happens. The empath discovers self-compassion. For years, they poured empathy outward, leaving none for themselves. But when they finally taste their own compassion, they realize that self-love is not selfishness, it is survival. Carl Jung might describe this as a meeting with the self, the deepest center of the psyche that unites all opposites. By choosing themselves, the empath begins to integrate their shadow, their light, their wounds, and their healing power. They become less fragmented, less divided, and more whole. This awakening is not easy. It often comes with guilt, with pushback from those who benefited from the empath's endless giving, and with moments of doubt. But beneath the chaos, there is peace growing, a peace rooted in authenticity rather than performance. The empath is no longer a mirror. They are becoming a flame burning from within, steady, radiant, and finally free. Part 3. The resistance, when the world pushes back. When the empath finally chooses themselves, the world around them does not clap in celebration. Instead, resistance rises. Friends, family, partners, even colleagues, those who relied on the empath's constant giving, may suddenly feel threatened, betrayed, or abandoned. This is one of the most difficult stages of the empath's journey, because for years, perhaps decades, the empath was conditioned to believe that their worth depended on their usefulness to others. They were the listener, the comforter, the problem solver, the emotional sponge. When that dynamic changes, those who benefited from it are forced to face their own shadows, and many resist. Carl Jung's psychology helps us understand why. He explained that relationships often operate through projections. We see in others what we cannot face in ourselves. Many people project their wounds, needs, and insecurities onto empaths because empaths willingly carry them. But when the empath withdraws, when they say no more, I must heal myself, those same people are confronted with their own unresolved darkness. The reaction can be anger, manipulation, guilt-tripping, or even abandonment. Byung-Chul Han sheds further light. In the Burnout Society, he describes how modern life functions like an endless marketplace of demands. Empaths, in saying no, break the invisible contract of constant availability. In a culture that worships productivity and compliance, the empath's refusal to give becomes an act of rebellion. But here lies the paradox. While resistance from others can be painful, it also reveals truth. The empath begins to see which relationships were genuine and which existed only to consume their energy. Choosing themselves becomes a filter that separates love from dependency, authenticity from exploitation. This stage hurts. It feels like loss. But in truth, it is the pruning of the soul. The empath is clearing space for relationships that are mutual, balanced, and nourishing. They are slowly learning that love given freely must also flow back freely. Part 4. The transformation, integrating the shadow and the self. Once the resistance has been endured, something begins to shift within the empath. They no longer collapse under guilt as easily. They no longer tremble when saying no. Their energy, once scattered outward, begins to consolidate inward. This is the birth of transformation. Jung's process of individuation is central here. Individuation is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming whole. For the empath, wholeness means embracing not only their gentle, giving nature, but also the parts they once disowned. Their anger, their ambition, their desires, their boundaries. The shadow that was once hidden starts to emerge, not as a monster to be feared, but as a teacher to be integrated. The empath realizes that anger is not cruelty. It is a signal of crossed boundaries. That ambition is not arrogance. It is the pursuit of potential. That desire is not selfishness. It is the pulse of life. Byung-Chul Han's insights support this awakening. He argues that modern individuals often collapse under the positivity imperative, the command to always be agreeable, productive, smiling. The empath, however, in integrating their shadow, begins to resist this false positivity. They allow themselves to rest, to grieve, to rage, to desire, and in doing so, they reclaim their humanity. This transformation is not only psychological but spiritual. Jung described the self as the archetype of wholeness, the guiding principle of the psyche. When the empath turns inward, integrates their shadow, and claims their power, they begin to align with this deeper self. They become more authentic, grounded, and radiant, not because they are serving everyone else, but because they are living in truth. Others may notice it, a new calm, a new clarity, a strength that does not shout but cannot be shaken. The empath no longer bends under every demand. They stand rooted like a tree whose roots reach deep into the soil of self-knowledge. Part 5. The Discovery of Power. Empathy with Boundaries. One of the greatest myths about empaths is that they must either give endlessly or shut down completely. But when the empath finally chooses themselves, they discover a third path: empathy with boundaries. This stage is revolutionary. For the first time, the empath learns to hold both compassion and self-protection at once. They realize that saying, "I care about you, but I cannot carry this for you," is not cruelty, it is respect, both for themselves and for the other. Carl Jung would call this a balancing of opposites. The empath integrates their nurturing nature with their assertive will. They no longer oscillate between martyrdom and isolation. They embody both care and strength. Byung-Chul Han's philosophy also resonates here. In a society obsessed with consumption, of products, of attention, of energy, the empath learns to resist being consumed. They place boundaries not as walls but as filters, allowing love and reciprocity to flow while keeping exploitation and toxicity out. And this discovery of power changes everything. The empath's relationships begin to evolve. They attract people who respect their boundaries, who give as well as receive, who see them not as a resource but as a person. Their sense of identity stabilizes. They are no longer defined by what they do for others. They are defined by who they are. The empath realizes that their sensitivity is not a curse, it is a gift. But a gift must be honored, protected, and directed with wisdom. When they choose themselves, their empathy sharpens. It becomes clearer, stronger, less diluted by exhaustion or resentment. This is the empath reborn, not as a victim of their own sensitivity, but as a master of it. They step into the world not as a sponge absorbing everyone's pain, but as a radiant presence that offers light without losing its own fire. Part 6. The Freedom of Authenticity, Living Beyond Roles. By the time the empath reaches this stage, something extraordinary has taken place. The heavy roles that once defined them begin to dissolve. They are no longer chained to the identity of the helper, the giver, or the fixer. They begin to live, perhaps for the first time, as themselves. Carl Jung explained that most people live through personas, masks that society demands we wear. For the empath, the mask has often been the selfless one. It wins approval, praise, and belonging. But deep down, it is also a prison. To choose themselves is to tear away that mask and face the terrifying, liberating question, who am I without my role? This is where authenticity emerges. The empath begins to pursue desires they once suppressed, creative passions, personal goals, even dreams that were sacrificed long ago. They start to speak truths they once swallowed. They show emotions they once hid. Byung-Chul Han's philosophy adds urgency here. He warns that our age has reduced people to achievement, subjects measured by output, productivity, service. But when the empath drops their mask, they step outside this system. They begin to live not as a product, but as a presence, not as a resource, but as a soul. This freedom is electrifying. It comes with risks, the risk of rejection, of misunderstanding, of walking paths alone. But it also brings the deepest reward, the discovery that authenticity, even when it costs, gives life a richness that performance never can. At this stage, the empath is no longer trapped in endless giving, nor hiding behind walls of protection. They live openly, but with strength. They give freely, but never at the expense of themselves. They are becoming what Jung would call individuated, a human being in full, no longer fractured, no longer reduced to a role. Part 7. The Ripple Effect. Healing through example. When the empath chooses themselves, the transformation does not stop with them. It begins to ripple outward, touching everyone around them. At first, some resisted their change, but over time, something remarkable happens. People notice the peace, the strength, the quiet confidence that now surrounds them. They see a person who can care deeply without collapsing, who can love without losing themselves, who can stand firm without cruelty. And in witnessing this, others are inspired to begin their own healing journeys. Carl Jung often spoke of the collective unconscious, the deep web that connects all human souls. When one person heals, the effect is not isolated. It sends signals through this collective, making transformation possible for others. The empath's choice to prioritize themselves is not selfish. It is a contribution to the healing of the whole. Byung-Chul Han would frame this as resistance against a system of exploitation. In a world where people are drained by endless demands, the empath becomes a living example of another way of being, one rooted in rest, balance, and dignity. Their life becomes a quiet rebellion against burnout culture, and this ripple continues. Children of empaths see a model of boundaries. Friends of empaths learn that relationships can be mutual. Partners of empaths discover that love is strongest when both are free. The empath, in choosing themselves, creates a legacy of healthier connection for generations to come, ending the return of the empowered empath. So what happens when the empath finally chooses themselves? They break the cycle of self-erasure. They confront the shadow. They endure resistance. They integrate their strength. They claim authenticity. And ultimately, they ripple healing into the world around them. Carl Jung would say they have moved closer to the self, the wholeness that waits within each of us. Byung-Chul Han would say they have resisted the culture of burnout and reclaimed their soul. But beyond theory, beyond philosophy, lies a simple truth. When the empath finally chooses themselves, they are no longer defined by what they give away. They are defined by the light they carry, the truth they live, and the freedom they embody. To every empath listening, your sensitivity is not weakness, and your boundaries are not cruelty. Choosing yourself is not abandonment, it is alignment. It is the path to becoming whole, radiant, and free. And perhaps, just perhaps, your choice to love yourself first will be the very spark that gives others permission to do the same. Thank you for joining us today on Psych Muse. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and keep walking with us as we explore the wisdom of psychology and philosophy for the modern soul. Until next time, choose yourself and watch the world transform.